India and Pakistan in 1965. Israel against Jordan, Syria, and Egypt in 1967. By 1968, Eugene Rabinowitz believed that international cooperation was quickly being diminished by international anarchy. He wrote an apocryphal editorial under the title The Dismal Record and jumped the Doomsday Clock forward 7 minutes to midnight. If the editorial mood at the Bulletin was gloomy, the scientists personally still held hope for the world.
Kennedy started the effort, Johnson finished it, and Nixon signed it. And that was the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
The 1969 treaty authorized the 5 nations holding nuclear weapons to help other states develop nuclear power. In turn, the non-nuclear states agreed not to develop or obtain nuclear weapons.
It grew from an original 70 countries now to every country in the world except for India, Israel, and Pakistan.
Rabinowitz was encouraged by the agreement. In the April 1969 issue, he reset the clock's minute hand to 10 minutes. But hope waned with a new threat of nuclear war.
It would be Europe that would be turned into cinders, not the United States or the Soviet Union.
The Soviet Union's Tsar Bomba was the largest nuclear weapon ever constructed and detonated. Tested in 1961, the fusion bomb's yield was 50 megatons, with a design capable of an estimated 100 megatons. The Doomsday Clock will return in a moment.
By the late 1960s, the arms race between the US and the Soviet Union threatened to spin out of control. Finally, in 1969, the 2 superpowers agreed to discuss a reduction of nuclear weapons.
The leaderships of the 2 countries had just encountered each other every once in a while at summit meetings, but they'd never really been able to engage on reducing or eliminating or controlling nuclear weapons. And in the late 1960s, the Soviets finally agreed that this is something that they would be willing at least to discuss.
3 years after negotiations had begun at the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT, President Richard Nixon and General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev signed 2 agreements in Moscow. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty limited the deployment of ABM defenses, and the interim agreement froze the number of strategic ballistic missiles at 1972 levels, but only for 5 years.
Was putting a cap on the arms race, essentially. And it worked. It didn't prevent the development of all nuclear weapons, but it prevented the arms race from spiraling completely out of control.
In June 1972, Bernard Feld, a member of the Bulletin's board of directors, wrote that the board was generally pleased with the ABM treaty, but wary of the interim agreement. Still, SALT II treaty negotiations were set to begin later in the year. In a hopeful spirit, the clock was moved backwards. The new time, 12 minutes to midnight, then the farthest jump back. On May 15, 1973, Eugene Rabinowitz died. The Bulletin lost its principal intellectual and editorial voice. 53-year-old physicist Bernard Feld became the new editor-in-chief. As a research scientist, he had helped usher in the atomic era. As a concerned scientist, he advocated nuclear disarmament. By 1974, the Bulletin's board adopted a new system to reset the Doomsday Clock. It would no longer be the decision of one man. Instead, members would have to come to a consensus. In May, the board made its first decision to reset the clock. India exploded what it called a nuclear device.
They didn't call it a bomb. They were very adamant about not calling it a bomb, but everybody knew exactly what it was.
In 1974, the new time was 9 minutes before midnight. It wouldn't stop there. 5 years later, on December 26, 1979, the Soviet Union dispatched tanks and troops to Afghanistan to prop up a pro-Soviet government. The relationship between Moscow and Washington worsened.
There was great fear that this was an early sign that the Soviet Union was going to be throwing its military weight around and might even decide it was time to invade Europe. So it was of great concern to the NATO alliance and to the United States as well.
President Jimmy Carter asked the Senate to postpone action on SALT II, the arms limitation initiative that he and General Secretary Brezhnev had recently signed.
Afghanistan just completely pushed the U.S.-Soviet relationship off track.
Bernard Feld offered his general assessment of an unstable world in the Bulletin's January 1980 issue. SALT II had stalled again. Religious fanaticism in the Middle East was on the rise, and millions were being killed by the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. The minute hand was moved forward and set at 7 minutes to midnight.
Here we are, back again at 7 minutes to midnight, back where we started. This is a very troubling time for a lot of the people at the Bulletin, and I think they wanted to reflect that in the clock.
The new decade had barely begun when suddenly nuclear war in Europe seemed possible. The Soviet Union had deployed a new generation of strategic weapons.
They were called the SS-20 in related systems, and these were intermediate range weapons. That is, from the territory of the Soviet Union, they could strike all the major capitals of Europe.
As a countermeasure, the U.S. deployed its own missiles on hair-trigger alert in NATO Europe.
We called ours the Pershing missiles and the ground-launched cruise missiles. So a new phase of the nuclear arms race opened up in Europe. That if there was a conflict and it went nuclear, it would be Europe that would be turned into cinders, not the United States or the Soviet Union.
January 1981, Bernard Feld wrote,
"Both sides willfully delude themselves that a nuclear war can remain limited or even be won. In 1980, both sides officially declared nuclear war thinkable."
Thinkable dictated a radical change. 4 minutes to midnight.
The President of the United States.
The weapons buildup that began with President Carter was expanded and accelerated under President Ronald Reagan.
Mission Director acknowledged.
He had campaigned on the position that the United States had become dangerously weak in relation to the Soviet Union.
2, 1, mark.
SALT II was, in his opinion, fatally flawed. The way to end the Cold War was to win it by destroying the evil Soviet Union.
Let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, they are the focus of evil in the modern world.
The Bulletin had no illusions about the Soviet Union. They simply thought the two countries had to work together. When Reagan made his evil empire speech, it seemed to indicate to many, including editors at the Bulletin, that Reagan had a different vision, and that scared them greatly.
Reagan purported that America needed to construct an impermeable shield in space. In 1983, he announced an extensive research and development effort, the Strategic Defense Initiative, for the purpose of building the perfect missile defense program.
We seek neither military superiority nor political advantage. Our only purpose, one all people share, is to search for ways to reduce the danger of nuclear war.
Critics quickly dubbed Reagan's plan Star Wars after the movie. They complained that if it worked, it would violate the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, encourage the militarization of space, and lead to the resumption of an all-out nuclear arms race.
As soon as the United States contemplated a perfect ballistic missile defense, then the Russian strategic arsenal and its capabilities was undermined. And so as a result, the Soviets were initially very, very concerned about the Strategic Defense Initiative.
January 1984, Bulletin editors reacted. The Doomsday Clock moved dramatically forward. 3 minutes to midnight.